pretty hot. Marijuana use, you have to like waiting room only and sit in the hallway. And then if you go to cultural competence, you can sit in the front row. Heck, you can like sit right beside me if you want. Right. So I think there is a reason for that. And, when I was teaching this even to residents, sometimes I would talk to them and sometimes there's feedback. And so I think these are some of the things that over time I've heard. The reason why this topic is not more common and more popular is, it's for these kinds of things that I've listed. Now, I know that we have questions at the end, but at this point in time, I would invite you to just type a few words in the chat if you've heard any of this before. Or this is like foreign to you, wow. Or this is like, yeah, I see this a lot. Just maybe a quick chat responder. Yeah, so Smita has, especially the last one, right? Great. So we've got a 2-3 responses. That's good. So I want to just start by saying that having these kinds of thoughts is common. And so if you are an educator in this field, or you are trying to bring this to the program, it's no wonder that we can encounter this. Some people think that it's only for it's common, like good clinical practice. You don't need to talk about culture. It will just outflow from you. And I think that maybe in an ideal world it is, but just like many things in the world, I don't think it does unless we intentionally focus and talk about it. So I think that these thoughts are, I wanted to flag it because I think it can impede people from becoming excited about this topic. And it can also impede our own learning with it, because sometimes we think it's not necessary. Other times we think it's just impossible because there's so many cultural groups. And also I would want to say, bringing a little bit from mindfulness and ACT, there's nothing wrong with any of these thoughts, right? Because they are just thoughts and they are just regular, I guess, common reaction too. And so if we want to go from, we just talk about politics, but if we go from a non-divisive kind of place, a non-judgmental kind of place, we need to acknowledge, first of all, these thoughts may be the first thing that people think about when we talk about cultural competence, and acknowledge that, yeah, these thoughts may be there. And there's even nothing inherently evil or wrong about these thoughts. And yet we can kind of make room for these thoughts, a diversity of thoughts, just like we need to make room for diversity of ideas. And then we need to still allow ourselves to critically look at how do we provide the best care that we can in light of cultural issues and in light of what's on this slide. So perhaps to begin, we can look at then, when we say cultural competence, even with the word culture, what do we really mean by that? And I think that this metaphor is one of the best way to talk about culture. So if we look at the school of fishes, right, they are always swimming in water. And if you ask a fish, what is water like? They probably can't really tell you because they're bathed in it. They are swimming through it all the time. It's probably invisible to them. They both ingest it and then they poop out of it, and the great cycle continues. It just becomes everything that's around them, right? And yet they realize it's precious to them when they're out of their element, right? It's the proverbial fish out of the water. That's when they really miss it, right? So culture is kind of bathing us, enveloping us, and we don't really realize it until we're at a cultural interface, when we encounter a different culture and say, oh, I didn't know they do that over here, right? And this can happen to us when we travel, and this can happen to us obviously for immigrants that goes to a new place and where there's this cultural shock, right? I think the other interesting thing about just this image is you see just a school of fish, right? So of course there's another metaphor there that culture invisibly guides us as a collective of what we do as well. That if you ask a fish, why are you swimming this way? They may not be able to tell you exactly, right? And yet they have this coordinated synchronization that goes on. So I will just go over 5 key concepts, and I think it's great to consider when we're talking about cultural competence. One is to have a broad definition of culture. Then, um, so Klukan in 1962 says every man is in certain respects, and it goes from the bottom up, like all other men, like some other men, and like no other men. So I think that really maps out to 3 different kind of layers. That in some respects, there's a universality to the human experience that we all, cut from the same cloth. And I think that is a great perspective. And again, there's nothing wrong with this perspective. It's a great humanizing perspective. And if in psychiatric care, when we give a medication, there is an assumption that if I give an SSRI to you, I don't first say, well, what race are you from, right? So what cultural group from you from? So in other words, we think in a universal way a lot of the times. And again, it's not a bad thing. It humanizes us. There's a commonality. And then on the other extreme, in psychotherapy, on one-on-one, we always care about the individual. What did you experience? What kind of childhood memories do you have? What's the father, mother like? Right? So we care so much about the individual experience. Again, there's nothing wrong with that because that enables us to have individualized understanding of the human experience. So these things are not necessarily contradictory, but they are so important in care. And what we are talking about today is this middle layer when there are different cultural groupings, and that gives us, again, another perspective. So we're not here to debate which is the core, the best way. Perhaps these are all complementary ways of helping us conceptualize, move forward, and deliver better care. So the universal layer, the individual layer, and then there's a group cultural layer. And this way of defining culture then, yes, it can apply to different ethno-cultural groups, Asian, Blacks, Hispanics, whites. And these are particular labels, especially relevant in the US. In Canada, it's more talking about multiculturalism and all the different kinds of different microcultures. And you can use this concept for gender differences, right? And all the different social, cultural variables, different groupings, even healthcare providers, even us coming together, there's a certain vocabulary, common value systems, common things we believe in a mental health care setting. Even talking about the elections, this might be very different conversation in the beginning if there was some other cultural group, right? So I think it's good to broaden the definition of culture beyond just ethnicity per se. And of course, I wouldn't be remiss if it would be remiss if I didn't mention how come there's only men on the left-hand side. I think this is reflective of the culture in 1962 when there was only men. Before women was created from Eve in 1962. But I think it's reflective of the culture back then when the common use of the word men is, really human beings. So this is obviously something that will not be acceptable today. But this is just a quote from 1962, so I'm aware of that. But we can also look at this as a cultural relic of its time when it was men was used in that way when we now would use people, right? So that's culture. So what is cultural competence? So I think Terry Cross and her work and her group's work, I think is the defining work about cultural competence. So her group says It's a set of congruent behaviors, attitudes, and policies that come together in a system, agency, or among professionals that enable the system, agency, and the professionals to work effectively in cross-cultural situations. So I think this is a beautiful definition. So it is about different kinds of clinical behavioral attitudes, but it's also about systems policies, right? So it's about professionals working with the system. And the last little bit, it's about cross-cultural situations, right? So it's about those cross-cultural interfaces. It's about working effectively. So notice here, it isn't about being an expert. It doesn't say expert. So many people oftentimes they say, I don't like cultural competence because, how do I master someone's culture? Well, it is not about mastering anybody's culture. I'm not a cultural expert in 10 different cultures. I'm not even an expert in Canadian culture. I may not even be the best cultural expert for Chinese culture. If you talk to a Chinese historian, he knows like 10,000 times more than me, right? So, and then what right do I have talking about cultural competence? Well, I think it's more about what this definition is here. It's about trying to look at these issues so that it helps us to become cognizant and work a bit more effectively in cross-cultural situations where cross-culture actually is about any kind of cultural interface. Right. So not only about ethnic culture, as we discussed, and we become cognizant to, I wonder how this particular cultural dimension influence you, whether, being a social worker in a space where, maybe in psychiatry conferences, how social worker feels about the label of being a social worker, the pluses and the minuses, and, who is always asked to take care of certain things, be it for the better or for the worse, the pros and cons, right? So I think it's just kind of to be able to think that way. And then the other thing is just to clarify the word competence. Competence isn't expert. It's not being expert. So now with competency-based education, this is becoming more important, right? So when we have competency-based education, it's to ensure that there's safety there, there's responsibility there to say, and that's why I prefer cultural competence over cultural humility. I love cultural humility, I think is part of cultural competence. But would you go to a humble dentist and open your mouth and let the humble dentist drill in you? Or would you want to ensure that there's a competent dentist? You may not want like the best dentist in all of Vermont, but you want a competent, passing mark competent dentist. And that's what we mean, that when we talk about cultural competence and why it's important, it's like we want a passing mark. We want someone that is not going to neglect cultural differences altogether and transgress and do harm, right? So there's a sense of cultural safety in there. So humility, just saying, well, I'm not a cultural competent expert, so just let me make some racist remark, it's not going to be helpful, right? It's not good to say, well, since I'm not a cultural competent expert, just let them smida, you can see smida, but with me, you just kind of excuse my ignorance and so I think that cultural competence holds us to a certain standard, not to say we need to master anybody's culture, but to say that, it's my value to try to respect your culture. And if I make a transgression, that's kind of my mistake. And I want to know about it. And I want to gain that cultural competence. So I think cultural humility needs to be part of it. Cultural safety needs to be part of it. And I think in a psychiatric profession, we don't need to shy away from saying, let's hold each other accountable for a certain degree of cultural competence, right? And not to shy away and say, well, let the anthropologist do that, right? And so there are different ways of looking at cultural competence. We can look at a micro level, meso level, macro level. So clinically, how do we become cultural competent in the person ahead in front of us? I think that's so important. At the same time, I think more and more, I think people are cognizant that we also need to look at the whole program level and the whole institute. Because you can be the most cultural competent expert, But if you are straitjacketed, so to speak, in your program, and this is how you respond, and these are the forms you have to fill, and this is how many minutes you allotted, then maybe some of those things goes out the window. We can only speak in English in this ward, I'm sorry, right? And if you don't speak any other language, take the medications, right? And don't speak so much, right? So the program is so much more powerful in some cases. And then, of course, the greater society, we talk about policy changes, we talk about legislation changes, and of course, the new administration, I think we all know what we're talking about. And that also has an impact about what is even safe to say, what is not a good thing to say, what you can say, but then you might get flack for it or is seen as certain things. So I think that we have to look at all these different levels of cultural competence. And I think if we look at it this way, I think structural competence is talking about that middle layer, right, which is just as important. And then, and even within structural competence, I think people would, of course, still need to pay attention to the other layers, right? And so for the clinical component, we can really look at those attitudes, knowledge, and skills. I think attitudes does include reflecting on and becoming aware and own our own cultural values and our biases, as well as really paying attention to our client worldview. That's why we start from that reflective questions. Do we have some of these questions in our minds? Because it's always nice to know where our biases are coming from, what our values are. And then, of course, the intention, the attitudes, we care about the client's worldview, including their cultural values, their biases, and how they see the world. And in terms of knowledge and skills, a lot of cultural competence courses can be about, 10 tips of working with Asians, right? So that can seem like it's the knowledge and skills that we need to require. And that's not the be all and end all. It's not just the knowledge, but it's also the skills of how to operationalize those things. Because what we don't want is to put people on simple boxes, right? And yet at the same time, it wouldn't be right to say there are no groups. So we have to be able to negotiate those tensions. And then on top of this is to become aware of how power influences everything. So that's all well and good, but power makes a difference in what kind of attitudes, knowledge, and skills are privy and felt to be important, right? So in here, we naturally would prioritize Western ways of conceptualizing things. And we can look at how power plays out both on the macro level, but also in the micro level. And so I mentioned just in the last slide about knowledge and skills and putting people in the boxes and not wanting to put people in the boxes. And so I think we can see this dichotomy, but it doesn't need to be dichotomy. It's like two ways of looking at cultural competence. There's a generic broad way of looking at culture and cultural competence, and there's a specific way. And again, it doesn't have to contradict each other, right? So you can develop ways of just being sensitive and attuned to how culture impacts generally on each of us. And you can also learn the cultural formulation, which we'll get to. And you can also do cultural consultation as a model that really looks at culture in a very broad way. And then you can also develop more interest in a particular cultural group, right? And there are people who specialize in feminists and female and the gender issues and women's mental health. And that's wonderful. And there are people who are really spend their lifetime about Asian mental health. And that's wonderful too. I hope that's wonderful too, right? And then there are people who are champions of other kinds, LGBTQ experts. And I think that's wonderful too. So I think that there's room for both a specific kind of cultural competence and also kind of broad generic competence. And we can see that in the DSM, the cultural formulation. And then there's also cultural bound syndrome, which has become more and more like a relic of the past, where we only need to know about the weird and wonderful glossary that only happens to particular cultural groups. It's not like it's bad to know about them because it just makes us think and expand our vision beyond the DSM criteria for depression, right? It's just that that isn't the only thing to learn about cultural competence, right? Which is those specific cultural bound syndromes. For those of you who are not familiar, cultural bound syndromes used to be the only way to talk about culture sometimes is a very specific syndromes that is not like a panic attack, but redefined in a particular cultural group, for example, right? So that's like attack the nervous, right? Or neurasthenia, those things. And I think it's actually okay to talk about those things in light of both the specific and the generic ways. So how does culture manifest? It manifests in so many different ways. If we look at cultural values, for example, it defines a lot of the stuff we do because values are important to us. So here, I'm a Canadian, and I'm talking to a US audience, but we are really like one big happy family. For now, there's still no wall between us, which is great. And you can see we are, cousins, families, bigger brother, Uncle Sam, any kind of relationship. My son would often say, US is our uncle. And of course, we still have our queen mother. You guys have got rid of the queen mother. But we are Canadians, but we are like, if you look at the profile, this is just one way of measuring values, the Hofstede, which actually comes from that used to be a tech giant of its era, IBM, International Business Machine, having employees all over the world looking at it. So you can just look at that profile, and that looks pretty familiar. So if you just look at the peak shape on the second, which is individualism, and if you just compare to, a place like China. So suddenly the second peak is gone. So this is from, and so you can just see the peak, which is so high here, so important to us, individualism, and rights and freedoms of the individual. And you can see in China, it's not quite there as in terms of a value. So I think this is a good example, good striking contrast. By the way, with all of these things about cultural groups, of course, there are flaws, and we can debate and argue. Is it really true? Is it each individual single person don't care about the rights and properties? Does it mean when I go up to the next Chinese person, I can just say, this is not your property, let me have yours? I'm not saying that, obviously. I'm just kind of making a point that some of these underlying value differences can shape and perhaps change the way we think. And individualism, collectivism, it's one of those cultural value dimensions that there are many, many different ways of measuring it. And yet, they all come to a convergence that, yes, there are cultural differences in how we tend to view things in a more individualistic perspective and collectivistic perspective. And this is just one of the ways. And this is just another example, I think published either this year or last year. First of all, I excerpt this because it's kind of fun. When it's the title is fun. This is not a new idea. Since I think 2010 already, people have been talking about it. But most of the time when in mental health, we are talking about weird psychology. Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic nations, right? So most of the mental health literature, psychology 101, it's built on weird culture. Weird in the sense that they don't represent the majority of human experiences by number, but they do represent by number what is represented in the literature. And this is how psychology works, how psyche works. This is regular mental health and development. So I think that this has given, I think, the field a lot of challenges. How do we encourage not only weird type of research, but enlarge it? Again, there's nothing wrong with having weird research, but it would be nice to have non-weird research too, to go beyond weird science. And this is just one example in this author trying to, again, do the same thing, measure values. And here they argue, or they use, one of the axes is US, because of course US defines the world. And then the other axis is China, saying, hey, there's a lot of population. And also because a lot of cultural studies like to have massive population. But if you use those as different axes and how cultural value distances from one or the other, they end up a map, right? So having a map. So this is not to say, I think, that US and China defines the world, but more like how cultures have differences in values, and there can be different ways of studying it. So those axes, I don't think is the important point. The more important point is that different cultures have different values, and it's important to know that some are closer to the others, and there are commonalities. Some are different, more different from others. And the challenge to us is to help ourselves understand this in a deeper way rather than simplifying things. So this is on a mega level. So what about at this level? So when you look at this, which includes a chicken or hen, a patch of grass and cow, and there are three things here. So what two things go together? So I would invite you to put down in the chat box, which two go together? So see if you can answer in chat, just two things that go together that comes to your mind. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the participation. And I love that comment about free range chicken as well. So great to be talking to a conscientious crowd. Yes, it's a free range chicken and a cow that we are not going to slaughter because we're just going to admire and yeah, and be one with it. I have actually stopped eating meat. Not that I want to preach to you guys about that, but now, yeah, cow and white. That's interesting. Now, so I just want to comment that this is the type of psychological exercise that's been done over and over again to highlight that we have different ways of perceiving. And if you group the two animals together, we are going by what's called like a rule-driven way of categorizing things. Because you learn in school that they go together, they have certain biology, they move, they talk, right? So it's categorical in a rule and knowledge-based sense, while cow and grass goes together in a contextual way. So it's contextual dependent and is more relationship dependent because there's a kind of a relationship, one eats the other, as you talk about. So that this is the type of things that you can do over and over again. By and large, Western kind of perception, it's more going to be rule-based. And also the more Western educated you are, because you are learning lots of Western kind of rules, it's more rule-based. And whereas in Asian country, if you're educated there, if you bathe in the Asian kind of culture, you tend to see more the cow and the grass going together. Obviously, it's not like this is not the one absolute test, right? It's like, okay, you feel to be, an Asian, or this, you're very Westernized. But this types of tests, I mean, like hundreds of tests over and over again. But what does this illustrate is that it can affect our immediate perception and how we categorize things, right? So this governs everything from how we interpret like a clinician in front of you, and how we perceive our problems, right? And how we see relationships work, how marriage ought to work, because there are certain rules, or is there certain kind of based on relationships, and how friendships work. So we can underlie everything that we do. So it's interesting to look at these invisible kind of cultural influences that can be there in a split second. And so there are even fMRI interest in looking at this. For example, on the left, you can see, and again, Chinese Asian, when they think about yourself and your mother, the similar parts of the brain light up, whereas for an average American in these very small, flawed fMRI study, though, it's like the other person, right? It's more like, oh, this is a mother, it's like a friend, it's different from a self because it's not the self, right? On the right-hand side, it's actually I think it was a systematic review of a whole bunch of these tiny, small studies um, that shows on average, like in a social process, for instance, in Asian, the parts of the brain that light up is more like trying to judge, and how are you feeling on the other person? Am I losing face? Am I saying something that would be embarrassing because that person's reacting badly? Am I upsetting the other person? It's caring about what the other person may think, may not think. Whereas in the Western context, the parts of brains that light up, it's more about how am I feeling at this moment? So they're very in touch with their own feelings, right? Whereas if you ask an Asian person, they may not be so much in touch with their own feelings, but they're trying to guess at what are you feeling, right? So they're more subtle, they're more trying to interpret very subtle cues, and it may not even be part of facial expression. Whereas in Western, everything gets more rule bound. It's actually what you say, what you mean, right? And if you say I'm unhappy, I'm unhappy. Whereas in Asian, if you say I'm happy, it can mean I'm unhappy just because there was a slight pause and there wasn't an immediate thing, right? So it is all about the differences in what is important. Whereas we say, how come you don't know what you're feeling? It's like, we don't know what we're feeling. We know what you might be feeling. We're trying to guess at what you're feeling. We don't know what we're feeling. So there may be a nuances and differences in the cultural emphasis on and a psychological level and an imperceptible 1 split second level categorizing things. And it may be also be, over time that becomes habits and brain patterns. These are the parts of the brains that light up that goes into processing overdrive when we're interacting with a multiple stimuli situation. So clinically, how do we take all this information, interesting information, into cultural practice, into psychiatric practice? I think that when we do the typical formulation, biopsychosocial or spiritual, if we take into account and do the grid, I think most people are familiar with the grid from different disciplines: predisposing, precipitating, perpetuating, protective. We can imagine that culture can pop up in any square, right? So this is to say that anytime you try to do a formulation, maybe after today, you think, I wonder how culture impacts on this. It can just be one additional question, right? So you can see for this person psychologically, this is so important. And let me take a step back from that cultural background. Why is that especially important or not important, right? So I think that just gives us a potentially an extra dimension. That's one way of doing cultural formulation. So DSM, in case you're not aware, there is an outline for cultural formulation, and it can also help us systematically look at these different aspects of culture, because there's can be so overwhelming and not everyone is an anthropologist. So how do we grapple with culture? Well, we can ask questions to just learn about the person's cultural identity. What kind of culture do you identify yourself with? Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's being an American. Maybe is, I'm a dog person, and a dog person is very culturally different from a cat person, right? So that kind of thing, and what kind of language, right? So the second is, how do you conceptualize what's wrong from your own cultural group if you do have a cultural affiliation? Sometimes it's because I've sinned too much. Sometimes it's because I'm reincarnated because my past life sin. Maybe I don't 100% believe in it, but maybe I partly think that I'm being punished by God. And that's very common, isn't it? Right? So if we invite those conversations, it becomes part of the discussion, right? And I think I give that example because it's not either or. Oftentimes, people have grasp for multiple explanations. So it isn't like every single Chinese person or Asian person are superstitious, but it's just part of one of many things that we wonder. Right? So I think it's kind of that kind of attitude that we can explore. And the third is to look at psychosocial cultural factors that can either helps us or kind of gives us stress. And the fourth is, what is the cultural dimension that may affect our relationship for the better or for the worse? Because you might think, I don't understand you. So what are some of the barriers that may interfere with us working together? and then the overall, how do we marry it to everything together? Now, if you think that that's really hard to get and you're interested in this, you can certainly look at the CFI in the back of DSM. The CFI and DSM-5, there's 16 different questions that I would like to say that you don't have to use it verbatim, but they give you, they inspire you to ask these kinds of questions when you're with a client or a patient, so that you can get at those things on the previous one, because the previous one was developed earlier. And we found that when we teach it, people are still not getting it in terms of asking it in clinical interviews. So CFI is developed to be a suggestion, although the researchers will tell you, you must follow this because that's how it's developed. But I think as a practitioner, and I'm going maybe even against the developer of this, is I think that these are suggested guidelines. So if you're curious, you can see this is how I can phrase things, and this can become part of my regular standard interviews. I think that will work best is if you feel that this can work for you. And so, we propose this kind of 3-tier model because oftentimes when we talk about cultural competence, people think it's kind of like a luxury because it's not core competence, or maybe it's okay as long as people like Smita is around, then it's the answer, right? So, but how does each one of us can incorporate a bit of it? So I think that we propose there may be different ways of looking at it. If you only have like half an hour to do an emergency kind of assessment, I think that when you're looking for symptoms of a person or stressors or supports, the 3 S's, you can think of it from a cultural perspective too. So that's where culture comes in. If you were only to ask 3 questions or think about culture or remind yourself about culture, it's like the symptom significance the person's presenting with. What does it mean to you to be thinking about suicide? What does that say after you die or kill yourself? You can go to hell. Oh, what is that like to have this, right? And what are the stresses and what are the supports for you? Because again, your family can be your great supporter or oftentimes your own supports. Similarly, your own church can be your own source of support, but maybe if you're gay, it can be your biggest stressor on your life, right? So, and then there are gay affirming churches as well, right? So even in a crisis, these things can come up. And then I think in your most regular care, if we do the grid, at least think about culture. And I think that if you have a longitudinal relationship with a patient, then I think it's great if you can develop an outline for cultural formulation. If you're not going to see the person more than once, it's going to be ongoing care, and you're not pressed for like only 45 minutes to ask, the skit questions or something, then, I think it's great to have the CFI and to, go deeper in detail because it's going to be helpful for guidance. And in terms of actually delivering care, why does it matter? And I think that I'm just going to give you snippets because each of this can be an hour talk. Because I just recorded a psychopharmacology talk for 1 hour yesterday. So, but instead of starting a 1 hour talk on psychopharmacology, just suffice it to say that there are people who, and I'm not an expert, but there are people who likes to study ethnopsychopharmacology. And we can remind ourselves, if you're going to use medication, both the pharmacokinetics, which is what the body does to the drug, and pharmacodynamics, what the drug does to the body, can be influenced by different ethnic and biological determinants with ethnic differences. Just as an example, perhaps one of the most studied one is the cytochrome P452D6. And after all the cytochrome P450, this is probably one that's best known, even among just general psychiatric practice, because it processes a lot of the psychiatric medications, although not all. So this is an example where the allele 10 is up to 70% in East Asians, and that can mean that the regular standard dose is too much for East Asian, and that accounts for it. Yeah, all right. So if you look at the absolute poor metabolizers, actually white Caucasian has the highest absolute absolute poor metabolizers. But for intermediate metabolizers, East Asians have more. Now, how about pharmacodynamics? And this is just a newer field, which is, do people respond differently? And so, for example, people are trying to predict antidepressant response based on a certain serotonin transporter gene. And they study this. Is the L allele better or the S allele better? But for example, in this study, it shows that maybe the idea that L allele is better, maybe that matters more only in white Caucasians. Again, is because of the number of studies, but maybe Asians is not the case from that kind of meta-analysis. And this is, and again, in a study that comes after, you can see in the top graph, for Caucasian, for the L allele, it predicts a greater drop, right, compared to the middle graph and the lower graph. But for Koreans, that is not the case, right? So this is just, again, a reminder, as we make these new discoveries, this is how human being works. Even this, so biological, there may be ethnic differences and people don't understand why. And again, clinically, when we give clozapine, for instance, on the upper left-hand corner, since 2015, the FDA has come out, and if you are not already familiar, is that benign neutropenia is something that is very common among Black Americans. And so if you use the standard guidelines, you're going to be stopping the medication a lot for a lot of people, which is unnecessary stop. So the FDA now recommends two different parameters for stopping the medication clozapine. And clozapine is a medication that you need frequent blood monitoring because you're worried about the neutrophils, the white blood cell count drop. But for Black Americans, at baseline, they naturally may have, some of them may have lower white count, so you can't use the same parameters. So this is another biological example of differences. So this is just, again, a paper echoing that there are just the predominant studies are so there's so much in the Western studies that are based on Western white Caucasian population, which is wonderful. And yet there needs to be more development of other ethnicities because not everything is the same from what we talk about, from the drug dose to the response to the side effects, right? And it's different. So we need to pay attention to that, right? So in psychotherapy and psychological intervention, that's even more the case, of course. And again, that can be in an hour talk. So without going into it too much, I wanted to just say that we can look at ways of adapting our psychotherapies, changing metaphors so that it's more culturally congruent and understandable with our clients. I think that's important to know. So that's why there is culturally adapted CBT, for example, for various kinds of groups, right? I think that's the tip of the iceberg, so to speak. I think in the middle layer is we can then look at those values and assumptions that we make, individualism versus collectivism, that can still guide the whole intervention. So for example, and the reason that I like mindfulness and ACT, as well as CBT, is that CBT is more emblematic of a Western derived, priority in logic and rule-based way of right and wrong and finding out the best way to think, which again is very helpful. It's evidence-based CBT. But then, of course, we also hear the emergence of mindfulness stuff. And mindfulness is like on everything, in every pop psychology magazine, and every website you go to about taking care of yourself in the pandemic. The first thing is about mindfulness, isn't it? So mindfulness does come from, actually, from Buddhism and Zen Buddhism and Eastern philosophies and Asian philosophies. Now, when I say this, I think it's very interesting because, first of all, there are Asians who are somewhat upset that, oh, how come mindfulness is culturally appropriated in the West? And right, and so there will be arguments. And then there are Western psychologists who say, I can prove to you a philosopher once upon a time in the West also said something very similar to mindfulness, right? So I don't want to get into that debate, but only to say that it does, I think, it is helpful to look at different cultural underlying assumptions about how the world works. And again, we don't have to say one is better than the other, but having this diverse way of thinking, I think symbolized by even mindfulness and CBT is helpful. And I think that's why there's some criticism that if you use mindfulness like a typical Western intervention, like use this skill to decrease your anxiety, a lot of people say it doesn't work. And one of the reasons it doesn't work is because it's missing some of the underlying deeper philosophies, right? So people who complain mindfulness doesn't work, there's a reason to that. So I think that the other reason to, you can say, pay homage or to dig deeper into just mindfulness being something just like yoga, right? So it's more than just learning like 10 different postures and you will become a yoga guru, right? It does come from a certain traditional culture and beliefs, and maybe it's helpful to know where that comes from. And even in terms of pragmatics to make it work better. I hope I'm not in a soapbox or anything to talk about this. But this is like the ACT model that I love to share, and it's I think it captures even maybe more than just mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, a lot of Buddhist philosophy. But again, only if you're aware of the Buddhist philosophy would you be able to, I think, to act in a way that is consistent with that philosophies. And this isn't an ACT workshop. Again, this can be at least an hour to 5-hour talk. But I would invite you now to join with me for what it's like to learn ACT through these hand gestures. So if you put your hands together, obviously I invite you to do that. You don't have to do that. You can continue to write and take notes if you will. But if you put your hands together, imagine that you're stuck with a thought and a feeling. So this represents kind of distress, a thought of like being stuck and feeling distressed. And in ACT, we train people to have this diffusion, which is gaining that distance, separation, you from your thoughts. So just appreciate as you open up your hands what that feels like to you. And then when you pivot, again, experience that in your hands. What is it like to pivot? So we're pivoting. We're not changing. We're not altering our thoughts, our feelings, like whether it's bad and depressed or hopeless. We don't need to alter it to a more positive thought. Just allow it to be there, the openness. And then we bring together ourselves to the present moment, not to the past or future. Find that center point. That's being centered in this present moment. And then there's a cup and a fist. Fist is the stories we live. Cup is the holder. So we can be the holder of our stories, but we don't have to be bound by it. So if we were traumatized yesterday, we can be here today to have a new story, right? Today, you can be here for the grand rounds of your life, right? So, and then if we pivot our hands again, this is our values. If you're in the desert, what do you not want to let it slip through your fingers? Or if you're living this life as a human being, what values are important to you that you don't want to let it slip through your fingers? And those are your values. And once we know where our values are, and that's pinky swear, how do we commit to our values through our actions? And that becomes the committed action. So those are the 6 core ACT processes in ACT that we are trying to teach, as opposed to, do you have a rational thought or can we have a more balanced thought? Again, neither approach is the be all and end all, I think. Every day today, we challenge our negative thoughts or we challenge our misconceptions. And then there are times when this method can become helpful. So that's to enhance the middle circle, which is psychological flexibility. So that's what ACT is about. That's what mindfulness in ACT is about. And so having said all of this, a lot of information, I think that another take-home point then is that there are so many different cultural models. And I hope that this gives you an idea that you can be more flexible in all ways. So when you're sitting down with a person, culture can come up. And sometimes, first of all, you can become aware of it. And when you become aware of it, sometimes you don't even have to talk about culture, just be aware. Sometimes you can find that the person's own supports is their cultural behaviors, whether it's praying, whether it's doing more meditation. So cultural congruent ways can be a way of helping a person up. But just because we talk about culture, it's not the same thing as being politically correct. So when a person says, in my tradition, I do this, it doesn't mean, okay, now do more of that, because sometimes we need to challenge it. So just because it's culture, on the one hand, we don't ignore it. We don't say it's inferior, because we can see where that gets us. At the same time, it's also not like, oh, that's untouchable. Once the person says, culturally, I have to obey my parents. So, okay, I guess you can never disagree then, right? So obviously we know that that's not true, right? Because we all have to disobey cultural rules all the time. So it is, in fact, highlighting and being in that dialogue. What is it like for you to live in that culture and yet having this little piece that makes it hard for you to relate to your parents? So this becomes a cultural discussion, right? So I think that we can use culture as a point of reference, but not absolute. That's why you don't have to be one or the other. I hope that is coming across too in this talk. That what we're trying to do is increase the complexity in a way so as to, I guess, as necessary, so that we don't get stuck, right? So that we are aware that we are always based in a cultural environment, that there is a systematic way for you to engage in a deeper way, both psychologically and as a human to human being, with the client that you're and the population you're trying to serve in a very human dimension. And then if we broaden it, we as service providers are based after all in our programs and services. So we have our culture too. So that's why we're challenging the weird science, how our institution used to be doing things. We're not saying it's wrong, but it's good to make the invisible visible, as we say. And so we all have our culture. So it's this interface of culture that can enrich us, our way of giving cultural competent care on a systemic level, right? So that we are bringing different worlds together to have that effective interface. And that's the cross-cultural effectiveness that we are talking about. We want to increase our effectiveness. Not saying you guys are not effective. You guys are already super effective, right? So it is always this relentless drive to increase our effectiveness over time. Now, just for the last several minutes, want to turn our attention to COVID. So COVID obviously is a mental health impact on, well, all of us. It's a pandemic. It's a global pandemic. So I can show you data across countries, but it certainly is affecting the general population, including the United States population for sure. And so before and after the pandemic, you can see that it's manifold increase in symptoms. And of course, there are ethnic and cultural differences. And so this is just, again, early studies, right, just coming out. And if you look at fear, worries, and threat, and vulnerabilities, yeah, everyone is threatened, but particular cultural groups in this instance is higher. In this survey, in the States, the pandemic, the highest is Asian groups. And also like among the different ethnic groups, 7.3. Also being foreign born itself is a stress, but you can see the intersectionality. If you have precarious status, if that adds to the quarantine, the housing, the job loss, sometimes you're working under the table, and all of this is going to compound and triple your stress level. And of course, racism, it's also a big thing. These are just local clippings from where I am at. And so this is just a Canadian national study that basically in the pandemic, Asians in particular are encountering racist incidents over 50%, like 60% have, and then this is in Canada, right? Canada, who thinks that we are not racist. Yeah, my father has been asked to go home since the pandemic, and this has never happened before. The patient I talked to yesterday had a racist incident, right? So it's just a common occurrence. Um, and so this has increased part of the pandemic stress. And this is the similar data, but US, this is a voluntary report line that the Asian groups had in the community, just ask Asian groups to report voluntary, not systemic, not scientific study. And just in the 5 months, they collect 2,500 reporting. And then obviously this is people who know about this survey and voluntary reporting. So this is a vast underestimation of just the regular day occurrences of what's happening. And so if we talk about the pandemic, then we need to talk about resilience. And so resilience, then, it's something that we've become interested in. And it's one of those things that help us help people cope in this pandemic. One of the critics some of the criticism of pandemic is it can be seen as a good thing to talk about resilience, but it can be blaming on the individual. How come you're not more resilient? Look at all those other people. They are resilient, right? So that can be the double-edged sword. I just want to caution that. So we need to talk about resilience in pandemic, but it's a double-edged sword because it can cut. It can say, look at those things. Those people are not resilient, what's that about an insult to you, just suck it up already, right? So I think that we can talk about internal resilience and external sources of resilience because we are bathed by context. So in this MSMR, which is our model of looking at resilience, we look at both internal, external, and also what's in between it. And in our inventory, it comes out to these kind of 3 layers, and it also comes out to different kinds of needs, a little bit similar to Maslow's kind of hierarchy, that there's essential needs, there's full kind of potential needs, and there's situational, just kind of changing water. Life is like water, like Bruce Lee kind of needs, right? And just share with you a little bit about our project. We are funded to respond to the Chinese community in Canada, in Ontario about it. So we developed like a project to increase the resilience. And so there are different kind of interventions, but one of the interventions that we were developing is PACER, which is based on the ACT. And so we're doing that with the Chinese community. And then we got funding from my hospital for healthcare providers. And this is, so I told you the different cultural groups. So this cultural group isn't the Chinese, it's the healthcare providers. So we have 2 arms of our study, the PACER group. One arm is to use an ACT-based intervention. This is both an interactive online thing plus a video conference as the pandemic acceptance and commitment to empowerment response program. So 2 arms, one's for the Chinese community, that cultural group. The other arm is for the healthcare providers as a cultural group. So it can include social workers, physicians, ICU nurses, but also housekeeping and people working in food services and cafeteria, because they are also exposed to COVID patients. So these are the 2 arms that we are doing. And we have the reason we call it the ACE model and not the ACT model is that the ACT model is in the center, but it's embedded into a social justice model, the GEP model, which is why we call it the acceptance and commitment to empowerment. So in addition to saying that self-care is important, teaching people mindfulness, teaching people what I've talked to you about those ACT skills, we are also doing these interactive exercises in this. Like in a pandemic, if we look at us versus them, who is in our camp, who isn't in our camp, and based on these picture card sword. So this is just an example of a game that we also use as part of it. So in the midst of delivering message about self-care, we also make room for talking about social justice and cultural issues too. It is not like when you can do self-care and not talk about wider social justice issue. We try to say that they are integrated. It is part of just pandemic response to talk about how I am stressed and also look at the social justice issue at the same time and not ignore it. by the way, I have to tell you, my first draft was red color and blue color, and some people say don't use it because it's too politically charged. So I had to change it to orange and green and say, okay, so is that like a politically like neutral color now? And we are from Canada, right? And someone says, I don't know, but red and blue may just be now in the news be associated with different, tribes. This is just from our early preliminary pilot. Just basically people love it. And people got more resilient on our own resilience measure, the MSR-MR measure. And in a more measure that you're familiar with, the GHQ, people are less stressed after doing it. And qualitatively, people feel that it can really help them rise up to the challenges in the pandemic. And also, if we look at, because they're interactive response, so in response to that interactive exercise, people are also reflecting on in this pandemic how they can be more inclusive in this pandemic, because I think it's important to say that it's interesting that in this pandemic, we're all in this together. It becomes a common phrase. So we need to think about that. Of course, in marginalized community, there's a challenge to say, no, we're not in this together. We may be in the same storm, but we're all in different boats. So when you talk to the marginalized community, this is the sentiment. We're all in different boats. Some are more privileged and they can stay home as long as they want and they are fine. There are those of us who are struggling. There are those who can walk down the street, and there are those even without a mask and they will not be called for. And there's those who walk down the street with a mask and will be, spat on, right? So that's the difference, right? And so we need to think about those different metaphors. And, now would now challenge us to think about even a third metaphor, to say, no, we are in the same storm and we're in the same boat together, because we want to have that universal feel. We are in the same boat together. We sink or swim together. But we also acknowledge there are different decks. It's like going to a cruise ship or Titanic. There are people who are more privileged. We cannot ignore that. But no mistake, this is a human enterprise. If the whole ship sinks, if we rock the boat too much, and it will, right? And so we need to address both the social inequality and we need to see the commonality at the same time as we weather the storm. So I will end my talk in that note and be open for questions.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Fung. That was a wonderful talk, lots to think about, and we'd probably like to hear you talk for many more hours, but I guess we're short on time. So folks can pop on their video and ask some questions if you'd like, or you can put the question in the chat and we'll go from there. Yep, Rebecca.
Yeah, I'm a clinical social worker, mostly retired, but I still work a little bit. And I thank you for the very useful and interesting talk, Dr. Fung. My question is, how would I deepen my understanding of, say, Chinese culture? Are there, I'm not sure if you mentioned resources, is it reading or what?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And on one of my earlier slides, there was just a small line of mental health resource center, and I think that link is in the slide where I showed the CFI. But if I'm not, I'm happy to send it in afterwards. Actually, for example, the McGill group, Lawrence Kermeyer group, have just we put together like a mental health resource center about cultural things. That's one thing. Just in terms of broadly like looking at culture. And of course, I invite you to join the SSPC, the Society for the Study of Psychiatry and Culture. I know we get a lot of fact that only psychiatry is in the name, but we really welcome social workers, anthropologists, clinical psychologists, and everyone. And Smita is a member. We have an upcoming webinar, for example, that is this afternoon. This afternoon, we are talking about Hearing Voices Network as a culture, like people who hear voices, for example. So we really recommend you to join that group. We have an annual meeting. And so that's plugging, my own society, why not? But yeah, so to I think fully immerse yourself to, let's say, Chinese culture, I think that there are different degrees of openness that people have from having Chinese food, which is just like the tip of the iceberg, to having, knowing many, because Chinese is also very heterogeneous too. As you know, there may be tension and differences between Hong Kong and China and Taiwan and many, many different groups, and the minority groups in China you've heard, and there's some are being persecuted, which I can't even say in China, but these are the complexities, and the more we delve deeper into it, the more because it's the more we have to know. And of course, there's Chinese and Asian philosophies and religion and value systems that are also changing. So I hope I'm not giving you a simple, but I hope I'm giving you a complex answer. Like the more you explore, the more you'll find out. And I think it's this balance of, I can never know enough. Like I don't know enough about Chinese culture, right? So, and also just like the question you have, we have another scale. Like even the thought of asking that question is, like 10 bonus points, right? So the thought of, hey, maybe I want to learn more, like that's already put you in the path, right? Of being cognizant and being aware of it, right?
Thank you.
There's so many people right now in the pandemic, like learning a new language. And there are some concepts that are just not translatable in language.
Uh-huh.
All right, well, I think our time is up. Lots of people want to know a link for the Hearing Voices meeting. Smita seems to be on it. Okay, they're in the chat. The answer's in the chat. All right, well, thank you,
Yeah.
Dr. Fung. That was a wonderful talk. So much for us to think about. We'll be talking about it for a while here. I'm sorry also about the Zoom applause. It's not as good as the real thing, but hopefully you can pretend what it used to sound like.
Thank you. Yeah, take care, everyone.
All right, thank you. You too. We'll see you. We'll follow your work. We'll see you somewhere.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fung.
Thank you so much.
you.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much.